without getting too many voters mad at you. The Republicans are determined to have nobody mad at them. Their real purpose is to protect the tax cuts of those at the very top brackets. But how do you keep giving tax cuts while complaining about the fact the government is spending more than it's taking in? In fact, $1.5 trillion a year more than it's collecting. The Republicans, once the party that championed fiscal responsibility, see no contradiction in all this. It's out to extend the Bush tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans and to continue to purposely confuse us by suggesting the Democrats want to eliminate the Bush tax for everyone, when in fact the Democrats are quite clear in saying they want to eliminate them only for the top 2 or 3% of taxpayers. Plus, first Charlie Rangel and now Maxine Waters are in trouble with the House Ethics Committee. Some members of the Congressional Black Caucus, who are speaking anonymously, are raising questions whether black lawmakers face more scrutiny than white lawmakers. And Pelosi versus the Pentagon. Defense Secretary Robert Gates says next summer's drawdown in Afghanistan will be fairly limited. The Speaker of the House is making it clear she expects to see a much faster withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. We're going to debate why we're in Afghanistan and whether we're doing any good there. Also, momentum may be growing among Republicans to deny citizenship to U.S.-born children of illegal immigrants. It looks like they want to make an issue of this for the fall campaign. And Sarah Palin once again says talk to the hand, which in her case has a handy note written on it for use in TV interviews. Can this go on? Let's start with the debate over tax cuts. U.S. Congressman Jim Moran is a Democrat from Virginia, and Congressman Brian Bilbray is a Republican from California. Congressman Bilbray, you first. Are you for where are you on these Bush tax cuts, which are set to terminate for everyone this January?
Well, Chris, I wasn't there when they were passed, but the fact is I think it's the worst time to be talking about taking in a new tax increase anywhere along the board, and you know that. Basically the biggest problem here is the fact that we can't continue to think that we're going to take money out of the economy and keep the economy strong. And I'm kind of interested because I've been listening for 10 years, people saying that all the tax cuts of Bush were only for the wealthy, and now I'm starting to hear that, we're only, there was some of it, or a large portion that might have been for the middle class, and we won't touch that part. It seems inconsistent with what I've been hearing for the last 10 years, and you got to admit that.
So you want to have keep all the Bush tax cuts for the next 10 years as you have for the last 10 years?
I think we darn well maintain it right now, and I don't think we have a right to ask the voters or the public to pay more taxes when we've already proven that we're mismanaging what we've got across the board. We had to go back to what we did in the late 90s, and that's say, look, let's rein in our expenditure. Our spending problem is the real problem, and allow the economy to grow past that and beyond the debt like we did in the late 90s.
Everybody says that. Everybody says that, Congressman. We have a 1.4, 1.7 range of deficit this year right now. Nobody's talking about cutting out of government spending by $1.4 trillion. I mean, everybody says let's get rid of spending. You don't have a program to get rid of $1.5 trillion in spending, do you?
We actually got started back in the 90s by saying we set a standard that we're going to hit the threshold. I mean, you start off with little things like why are we giving away surplus government funds to local governments or different nonprofits instead of spending and putting it on the market? $98 billion, $1 billion just in funds that are being given away in inappropriate funds that even the president talked about this last week.
Right.
And I think
I never get it. Next time I'm waiting for somebody to give me. Well, actually, Paul Ryan's giving me a list, but it's hard to come up with a list of actual spending cuts because nobody likes to be identified with those. Congressman Moran, where do you? Well, that's true. I mean, it's easy for tax cuts. This doesn't take a lot of guts to be for tax cuts for everybody. Admit it's easy. Admit it's easy, sir, to be for tax cuts.
Actually,
it's easy.
It is easy to do that. It's tough to be for saying no pay raises for the federal government through the next year. Let's start with that. Let's just start by saying, look, everybody's hurting, and those of us in the federal government are going to lead off on it.
That's popular. Screw the bureaucrats. Everybody loves to do that. Let's face it, the easiest politics in America is to say, I'm going to let the deficit stay real big, and by the way, I'm going to make it a little bigger by cutting taxes.
No, you're not. What you're doing is going to say the spending and the size of the federal government is the problem. We're trying to spend our way out of this problem, and that's how we got into the problem.
One last question. Do you believe that we actually increase government revenues when we cut taxes?
Absolutely. Because when it stimulates the economy, Clinton proved. Wait a minute, Clinton proved
let's cut taxes down to 1%. Let's get them down to 1%. Let's get them down to 1%. We'll balance the budget in 5 minutes. By your theory.
Look at California. We raised taxes, and look what we've done. I mean, Chris, we're driving companies
now. By your theory, why don't we just keep lowering taxes, sir, till we get them down to zero? Because by your theory, every time we lower taxes, we get more revenue coming in the door. This is like the loaves and the fishes.
No. There's obviously a balance, Chris. Look, I was a mayor. I was the chairman of a county. There's a balance there.
This
the
is
problem
popular.
is
I know everything you're saying. The voters out there on the Republican side especially are saying, thank God for Congressman Bilbray because he's going to cut our taxes.
Chris,
just don't tell me it's courageous.
Listen to the independents. Right. They are the people that are saying, look, they want a moderate approach here, but the attitude that we've reached is that spend. They didn't like Bush spending. They didn't like Republican spending, and now you expect them to like the Democrats spending more? They're not going to.
Your party used to be pay-as-you-go. Your party used to be balanced budgets, pay-as-you-go. The Jerry Ford party, the Bob Dole, the Bob Taft party was, if you're going to spend $1, you're going to raise $1. And you would always be honest about that. Now you say, magically, just keep cutting taxes, and somehow the government will balance its books magically, when nothing else in American economic life works that way.
Well, first of all, Chris, it's nothing magic for those of us in local government. That the fact is, when the private sector has the funds, they generate the revenue that pays our government tolls.
Okay, let me get balance in our timing here. Congressman Moran, you just heard the argument. Cutting taxes increases receipts. Somehow the government increases the amount of money it collects by lowering taxes. Just keep doing it. He says it works.
Well, it's not the first time we've heard that argument. We've been hearing it for decades. The fact is we need to do both. George H.W. Bush, the 41st president, did it the right way. He raised revenue and he cut spending. And then Bill Clinton followed on his lead with a balanced budget and created a surplus. Taxes went up, in fact, 39.6% for the highest level, but 23 million jobs were created, and it was the most after-tax revenue ever generated during that 8-year period by the most wealthy people in this country. The fact is that the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts generated 13% more revenue that came back to us, so 87% was unpaid for. It's $2.3 trillion that has been added to our deficit. It's the principal cause of the deficit.
Is the Bush tax cuts.
Is the Bush tax cuts, George W. Bush tax cuts. And what we need to do now is to do what Clinton and his father did to get us back into balance. Today we have 14.8% of GDP.
Why do you think the Clinton administration ended up with a surplus when Ronald Reagan, as much as he's beloved these days, did not end up with a surplus? He had a deficit every single year and growing. Why do you say that this program of cutting taxes somehow yields a balanced budget or brings back fiscal sanity somehow? Congressman Bilbray.
Chris, because Democrats and
Republicans...
When
has it happened?
Wait a minute. Democrats and Republicans, so Clinton and the Republicans finally got spending under control to the point to where the economy could catch up. That's why it worked. There was the one time that you saw a Democratic president and a Republican Congress finally, and it tussled, let's face it, it was a tough time, but we finally wrestled down the expansion of expenditures. Right now, we're going just the opposite.
Who was the last Republican to bounce the budget? Who was the last Republican president to bounce the budget now that you're the party of fiscal responsibility? When's the last Republican president? You had a Republican president under Bush, George W. Under Reagan, you had at least half control of Congress. When's the last time a Republican president has yielded a balanced budget or a surplus?
You had a Republican Congress that allowed a Democrat to do it, and that's a bipartisan kind of effort we made.
It was actually Dwight Eisenhower.
Bush went over the top after the war and used the war as an excuse to do domestic spending, and the Republicans made that mistake. But it doesn't mean that the Democrats have any reason to do the other, and that's why the independents are up raising. That's why this issue is going to be the top issue, and independents are deciding this. Chris, it's not Democrat-Republican partisanship. That's nonpartisan are really mad about this.
You can identify cuts that total less than 1% of the budget and a small fraction of the deficit. We're going to have to take a comprehensive approach, and the first thing we need to do is to get revenue back into a normal range. Normally, it's 20 to 21%, and that's basically exactly what we're spending, 20.6%. But today with the stimulus, it's more than that. But generally, that's about what it comes to. You can't balance the budget. You can't treat your grandchildren fairly when you're only bringing in less than 15% of GDP and you're spending over 20%. It's almost criminal what the Republican Party is willing to steal from their grandchildren and our grandchildren. That's the problem, Brian, just because it's politically popular, Brian.
Let's go back to 08 spending. Let's start by going back to a baseline that's defensible. Let's talk about take what's left of the stimulus and not spend it. Let's take what's left of TARP and not spend it. Let's prove to the American people that we're willing to take the tough